Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a program brought to you every week by the Pacifica Network. Our purpose is to analyze major economic events, the trends, the prices, the loans, the interest rates, all of it, to help us understand what's happening in the economy, how it impacts our world, our country, and our personal lives. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my life at several universities. Currently, I teach at the New School University in New York City, and I also write economics analysis and columns for truthout.org, which is an important, independent, daily source of news and analysis that I really would recommend you take a look at truthout.org. I also want to remind listeners and viewers that all of the materials that we present on this program, the analyses I offer, the statistics I refer to, can be found in greater detail on my website, rdwolff.com. And we also maintain a second website, democracyatwork.info, where the work we do about workers' self-directed enterprises, and we'll have more about that today, is carried. Either of those websites, rdwolff.com or democracyatwork.info, will provide you with much more elaboration of what we must briefly do here on this program. I would like to mention also that both of those websites have something called a donate button. And the work we do requires assistance, it requires research, and that means we have to raise money. I wish we didn't, but we do. And so if you're so disposed by what you hear or see on the program and what you find on the websites, please do not forget to send us what you might be able to do. And finally, the websites also provide you with a way to send in your questions and comments. We use them to shape what we do on this program, and we also respond to a few selected questions and comments at the end of each program, as we will do later today. So let's turn to the updates this week, and I want to begin by bringing you the results of a recently released study by the International Labor Organization, part of the organization set up with the founding of the United Nations. And they have a publication called World of Work, and the latest edition of that, released on June 3rd of 2013, talked about something it calls globalization's top winners. And here's what the ILO, the International Labor Organization, did. It looked at 5 major capitalist countries: the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And it looked at the 15 largest private corporations in each of those countries. And it asked the following statistical question: what's the ratio between the amount of money paid to the CEO of those 15 top corporations, the chief executive officer, the one who makes the decisions at the tippity top, and the average pay for a worker in that corporation? So it gives you a sense of the gap between the richest and the average worker by looking at the top 15 corporations in each of these 5 countries. They did a lot with these statistics. I'm only going to report to you one key statistic. For the latest year for which these statistics are available, which turns out to be 2011. So 2011, I'm going to give you a number, and the number refers to how many times the CEO's pay is larger than the average worker's pay in the top 15 companies. Start with the Netherlands. The ratio, 69 to 1. The CEO gets 69 times what the average worker gets in the top 15 corporations in the Netherlands. In Switzerland, a little bit better, 87. The top executive in Switzerland gets 87 times what the average worker gets. Germany, better still, 190 is the number. The top CEO gets 190 times what the average worker gets in the 15 largest corporations. In the United Kingdom, better still, 238. Yep, the CEO of the top 15 British companies gets 238 times what the average worker gets. But they're all put to shame by the fifth capitalist country, the United States of America. In 2011, the 15 top corporations in America, the CEO got 508 times what the average worker gets. Bottom line, that's how the United States became one of the most unequal in its distribution of income and wealth of all the developed industrial countries. They aren't even close. So if you want to know where the profits go that big corporations get, one place is to staggering pay packages for their top officials. The second update refers to what you might think of as the other end of the spectrum. The largest county bankruptcy in American history is unfolding. It's Jefferson County in Alabama, the county which houses, if you like, Birmingham, a major Southern American city. They got themselves into trouble a few years ago when they had to rebuild their sewers. Very expensive. They turned to a Wall Street firm, Morgan Stanley Chase, and wow, were the results stunning. J.P. Morgan Chase, was the bank in New York they went to. The bank talked with the commissioners, and before it was all over, bribes had been offered, bribes had been taken, deals had been struck, hundreds of millions of dollars were involved in fees, billions of dollars worth of construction. But here's what happened. In the deals, special arrangements were made that were supposed to save the county money. Turned out, when the economy crashed in 2008, they didn't save the county money, they cost the county money, and the county couldn't pay, and so the county declared bankruptcy as a way of trying to cope with these debts for the sewer system that they had worked out. Well, when you go into bankruptcy, people start looking at a deal. And as people began to look, it began to smell. And before the dust cleared, corruption charges were levied. The 5 county sewer commissioners who worked out the details with J.P. Morgan Chase in New York, every one of them has been convicted of corruption. 4 are in jail, and the 5th one is out of jail, if I understand correctly, got a lighter sentence in any case, because she was willing to turn evidence against the other 4. J.P. Morgan Chase has somehow escaped, no one quite understands it, being held accountable, but it has been fined and paid a big fine by the Securities and Exchange Commission, etc., etc. One has to wonder, when all of the other deals made by J.P. Morgan Chase and the other banks, with all the other cities and counties across the country that didn't have to declare bankruptcy, what are they all hiding? Final point about this. One of the victims, the people of Jefferson County, who have been told to expect 30% or more increase in the portion of their taxes that covers the sewer. So they're going to have to pay through the nose indefinitely as part of the costs of how we do business in the United States when it has to do with the infrastructure we talk about. The third update that I want to talk to you about has to do with the Minnesota Orchestra. Based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, this orchestra has been locked out. Let me explain. The charitable institution that runs the orchestra, which is the way most orchestras are run in the United States, wasn't happy with how the orchestra, 98 people in the orchestra, and it serves basically the state of Minnesota, which is why it's called the Minnesota Orchestra, they weren't happy with what they were being paid, that is, the charitable. And so they demanded cuts, 20, 30% cuts in the salaries, and wanting the musicians to pay for more of their pensions and medical and so on. The head of the committee that runs the Minnesota Orchestra, the negotiating committee struggling with the thing, is a major banker, Richard Davis by name. He is the CEO of Minneapolis-based U.S. Bank Corporation, the fifth largest bank in the United States. And he stuck it to the orchestra. They've been on strike since last year, so it's a long time. The musicians, many of them have found jobs elsewhere. It's not clear whether an orchestra can be fielded again. The season had to be scrapped. The people of Minneapolis don't have an orchestra. Minnesota doesn't have a statewide orchestra that was quite famous and quite well reputed. It's a disaster. But here's the statistic about this disaster I want to leave with you. Richard Davis, in the year 2010, took home, as the CEO of the U.S. Bank Corporation, $18.8 million. A little research shows that in that year, just 1 year, 2010, he took home much more money than the entire wage and benefit cost of the entire orchestra. That 1 year, he could have, with his pay, paid the entire cost of them and still had several $1 million to take home. So a millionaire with all the capacity personally not to deprive Minnesota of its orchestra chose instead to hold on to every nickel and to stick it to a collection of musicians, none of whom come even remotely close to the amount of money. A man with money able to deprive 100 musicians and their families of work, of a job, of the entire community of its orchestra. You really have to wonder what kind of an economic system would permit this on a regular basis. The last short economic update today that I want to talk to you about is the decision of the Greek government last week to shut down ERT, the public radio and television service in that country. It's been going many, many decades. It's the really only quality station. They have commercial stations, but this is the station that does the interesting social analysis and political debates and all of the quality cultural work. A right-wing government committed to austerity, imposing austerity on the country that has suffered the most, with a 27% unemployment rate in Greece, the level of the Great Depression in the United States, with a decimation of its working class, with cuts in its output of many percent over the last 2 or 3 years. Savaged by austerity, the same government is destroying public radio and television. It gives you a good, quick insight into what the political agenda is of those who support austerity. Make no mistake, it's very political. It wants to get rid of public service across the board. And that's something to think about, because Greece has been a pioneer in doing things that other countries do on the sly, a little more slowly, they wait a little. Much of what we see in Greece is our own future. And the shutting down of public radio and television is a cautionary tale for us not to miss. Last quick one. I said the other one was the last, but one more. The Philadelphia school system superintendent has announced savage cuts. Thousands more of employees in the school system, teachers, teachers' aides, being told they will not have a job come September. And he's worried about the viability of the school system. 300,000 education employees have been let go since this crisis hit America in 2008. What kind of a society, facing an economic downturn, chooses to cope with that downturn, not by taxing the super rich in the country, not by taxing the corporations who have $2 trillion they're sitting on, but instead taking away the public education of millions of our children, hobbling us in the future where we have to compete in a world economy, to save the most privileged from the small tax payments they would have to make to keep our schools functioning. An economic system that works like that is not one I would invest money in. Let me turn now, as I often do, to some major issues that I think need some analysis. And these are often issues where your comments and your feedback and your questions to our websites have played an important role. And so I want to deal with them. And there are 4 today, and I want to work quickly my way through them. We may not get to it, but each of them could take the entire time that I have, so I'll do the best I can. The first has to do with the relationship between capitalism and democracy. Do they go together? Do they not? And what's at stake? Well, the basic answer to that question is that they don't go together. Capitalism and democracy have had a very rocky and very spotty relationship. Democracy, and by that I mean the basic commitment that if a person or a group are affected by a decision, they are thereby entitled to participate in it. You can't be made to live with the consequences of decisions from which you are excluded. That is not democracy. Democracy means you get to participate in the decisions that affect your life. And I'm going to give you examples of how capitalism will have no truck with democracy. What capitalism does like, and that's been clear now for some decades, it likes elections. It likes to have a nice event, preferably once a year, where the citizens can go someplace and write something on a piece of paper or move a lever in a little voting closet and so on. Elections and capitalism go very well together. And I suspect the reason is that capitalism can control elections. It's figured out how to do that, whether it's paying the candidates or paying the parties or flooding the country with ideology and research, if I can abuse the term, giving their take on things. They can control what elections do. The best example and proof of it is, when was the last time you saw an election on the question, do we prefer capitalism or some other system given how it's working? You haven't seen that lately? That's right. You haven't seen it because it's not good for capitalists to put that question up. So they don't. They keep that question off. They keep us focused on, I don't know, gun registration or access to abortion or what we pay the local congressman. A lot of questions about issues large and small, but not the big ones. Not the big ones about what kind of economic system do we want. But you know, that's the least of it. It's much easier to show why capitalism and democracy don't go well together by noticing something which is so common and so routine that many of us may have missed it. When we go to work in an office, a store, or a factory, wherever we happen to work, we enter a place from which democracy is systematically excluded. Let me explain. If you're going to work in a factory, you enter 8 o'clock or whenever it is, and maybe you change your clothes the way you're told to, and you go to a machine the way you're told to, and you work on raw materials the way you're told to, and you do it in a way that you're told to, and whatever your brains and muscles help to produce immediately belongs to someone else who uses what you help to produce in the ways he or she sees fit, and you're not involved in that decision at all. at the end of the day, you're told to leave the premises, leave behind everything your brains and muscles help to produce, because your power to make any decision about the disposition of what you help to produce is exactly zero. You're to come back tomorrow and do it all again. In other words, and the same thing happens, by the way, in an office or in a store. You're an employee. You have no democratic rights. You have no democratic participation. Are you affected by the decisions made in your workplace? Of course you are. They decide what you produce. They decide how you produce. They decide where and when you produce. And they decide with what to do with whatever you help to produce. You live with all the consequences. Can they shut the office or store and move it elsewhere? You bet. Can they lay you off and get somebody else? You bet. Can they impose on you a technology that's not so good for your health? You bet. On and on we go with the decisions that affect you, but from whose decision-making process you as worker are excluded. No democracy at the workplace in capitalism. The capitalist keeps for themselves, himself or herself or themselves, all those powers. The board of directors makes the decision. The workers are excluded. So if there's no democracy at the workplace, what are we saying? We're saying that capitalism will not tolerate democracy at the workplace. And isn't that interesting? The place where adults in capitalist countries spend most of their lives, 5 out of 7 days a week, 8 of the best hours of the day, that's where we spend our lives. If we were a country genuinely committed to democracy, the workplace would be the first place where we would institutionalize democracy, where we would insist on it. Instead, we exempt our workplaces from the demand to be democratic. What kind of a commitment to democracy is that? Last point. Because we don't have democracy at the workplace, it never dawned on us to have democracy in the places where we train future workers, those places called schools. We don't have students learning the skills of how to get together and argue and debate and make the decisions that affect, or at least participate in the decisions that affect their education. We don't have democracy in our educational system because we don't want it there. What good would it do? How dangerous might it be to teach democracy in the schools, given that the workplaces people graduate into exclude it so systematically? The next time you hear about how capitalism is a mechanism or a support for democracy, don't be taken in. Second topic. Many of you have written to me and said something like the following. Yes, the current economic situation is not good. Yes, the current economic system isn't working well. But, and here's the point you've wanted to make, it's not because capitalism is a problem. It's precisely because our system isn't really capitalism anymore. It isn't a pure or a real capitalism. It's become deformed. It's become twisted. It's become something else. Many of you don't have a word to put on it, but your argument reaches the conclusion a solution for the current problem would be to go back to a better, purer, realer capitalism, because it would work well. When I've probed these comments sent to me and some of your questions, here's what I got. The economy today is intruded upon, intervened upon, shaped, controlled by the government in a way that makes it no longer real capitalism. And likewise, it's beset by big, monopolizing, powerful institutions, huge megacorporations, powerful trade unions, and so forth. And the argument seems to be, if we got rid of big government and its intrusions, and if we got rid of monopolistic big mega corporations and big mega unions, well then, we get back to a pure capitalism that would work wonderfully. And there's a little bit of a hint in these comments about the good old days when we had that. Let me respond. I've been an economic historian all my life. I've taught economic history. I study economic history. I do that because it's been my conviction all my adult life that the best way to understand what's going on now is to study what happened in the past, because it's rich with insights and clues and suggestions, which is the best we have to go on. So I've studied the history of capitalism, and here's what I've discovered. It has never been without massive governmental intrusion, and it has never been without massive presence and consequences of all kinds of monopolies. To be blunt, the notion of a pure capitalism without these, a pure capitalism that pre-existed these recent developments, that's a fantasy. That's make-believe. There's no evidence for that at all. Let me give you a few examples. The very beginning of the United States is an act of a government of the colonies fighting a war with Great Britain to create an independent country. The government was involved. The government mobilized the troops. The government fought the war. Fast forward throughout our history. The government protected us with the military. The government went to war when we felt as a nation, rightly or wrongly, threatened. The government has been crucial all along. The government these days, and for a long time, controls the money supply, or at least a major portion of it. The government has a judicial system. If Company A is unhappy with Company B and they signed a contract, they go to a government agency called the court system to have that worked out so they don't go after each other with bats. If someone afflicts us in terms of criminal activity, we call the police, we call the courts to help us. That's a government agency that maintains the peaceable nature of our existence. The government funds universities. The government funds hospitals. The government educates the vast majority of our people for 150 years. Today, the government teaches 3/4 of all college and university students, which are the key future workers in the skilled sectors of our economy. The government has always been a major player in our economy. Government intrusion isn't new. There is no capitalism in which government hasn't played a massive role. And the same is true for monopoly. Every business is always looking, may not find it, but every business is always looking whether they can corner the market, whether they can be the only one producing something, because then they know they can jack up the price. We have laws, by the way, something done by a government, that creates monopolies. These are called patent laws or copyright laws. Laws that allow a person who invents something to be the only one allowed to produce and sell it for a period of years, to have a monopoly and get all the benefit. The government works hand in hand to create a monopoly, and there are millions of our fellow citizens working hard, and many of them succeed, to create such monopolies. Likewise, companies do. Companies create monopolies to make money. Other companies try to undo those monopolies, recreate competition. You get the picture? Monopoly, competition, big government, smaller government. We've always had them. The notion of a pure capitalism is a fantasy. You're not going to solve our problems by going back to something that never was. You're going to have to deal with the interdependence of capitalism and government, monopoly and competition. So long as we have the capitalist system, these relationships are part and parcel of it. Let me take a short break, as we often do at this time. I will be back very, very quickly. Stay with us. Economic Update will return in a matter of seconds. Welcome back. This is Economic Update. I am Richard Wolff. I want to welcome you back to this edition of Economic Update. And again, to remind you that if any of the topics you find interesting that we cover on this program are worth more of your attention, you can find more material, these arguments developed in greater length and specificity, by going to either of our two major websites, rdwolff.com with two F's and democracyatwork.info. That's one word, democracyatwork.info. And again, not only will you find information that will be interesting to you and the development of these arguments that may interest you, but you will find two other things I would like to draw your attention to. Number one, a way in which to send us your comments, your questions, to help you help us shape this program to be as useful for you as we can possibly make it. And you will also find a donate button, which will allow you to show some support and help us to perform the work needed to make these weekly programs useful. I want to talk a little bit now about another major issue. And this has to do with the history of capitalism. You know, this is a system that has been around for 300-400 years now as the dominant system. Started in England, spread to Europe, spread to other parts of the world, and has now really truly become a world economic system. But it is important to understand that the current crisis of global capitalism has to be seen in the context of the history. And I'm going to do that briefly with you now because I think the light it sheds on where we are, and here I'm talking particularly to North America, Europe, and Japan, for reasons you'll see, because history is changing for them in a way that demands all of our attention. Let's deal with capitalism in its earliest phase. It begins as merchants and small producers break away from the old system in England and Europe. The old system was called feudalism. Landed mansions, landed plantations with a lord and serfs, they were called. The serfs did all the work. The lord collected what were called rents, lived off of those. People who didn't like living that way, people who broke out of that, ran away from the countryside where feudalism was focused into the cities and towns, which thereby became much larger, starting in the 16th, 17th century, and particularly in what is now Great Britain. And these were runaway peasants, these were small merchants, these were small craftsmen and women. And in the cities, they developed a new relationship. They weren't lord and serf, they were employer and employee, capitalist and worker. And they carved that relationship. And it proved successful. Lots of false starts, lots of capitalisms that got going for a while, sometimes for decades, only to be smashed by the old feudal lords who didn't want to see a new system developed. Sometimes they fell apart on their own because of the tension between the quite successful merchants and capitalists and the workers who weren't very happy at all because they had run away from feudal peasantry, but they had come to the cities where they lived awful lives. Crowded into the cities that weren't prepared for masses of people. They didn't have the housing, they didn't have the sewage, they didn't have anything. And you know, we all know a little bit about those early days. If you've ever read a novel by Charles Dickens, if you've ever read a novel by Émile Zola, if today you ever visit a third world major city, you will see all around it the desperate conditions on the edges of those cities of the people coming in off the countryside who are more than the city can handle, who can't stand the poverty of the countryside, can't stand the conditions there, often feudal-like conditions, and who leave and come to the city. Well, what happened in early capitalism was the following. After a while, conditions got better in the city. Workers struggled and got decent pay. Merchants and capitalists reinvested their money and grew. That's how capitalism grew. And as it did, it pulled in the countryside. Pretty soon it became impossible for the old feudal lords to survive. They were losing their peasants who couldn't be kept down on the farm, who wanted the life of the city, the better wages of the city, the better life in the city. Capitalism, to make a long story short, undermined, overthrew the old feudal lords, sometimes very violently, as in the French Revolution, and really in the American Revolution, because we created an independent country built on capitalism, having broken away from a country that was still, Britain, partly feudal, where the struggle between the feudals and the capital was still going on, and in Europe, very much still going on. So you might say that the first phase of capitalism was good for the city, good for the merchant, good for the capitalist, and good for the worker at the expense of the hinterland inside Britain, France, Germany, elsewhere. In the second phase, after capitalism kind of wins the struggle against feudalism, we get another kind of development. A tremendous explosion after about 1750, 1800, an explosion of capitalism's success. It has defeated feudalism, and it is roaring forward, growing by leaps and bounds, developing new technologies, but it now needs to bring in the resources of the whole world. It's kind of getting the food and raw materials from the agriculture nearby, but it goes further and further afield. The voyages of discovery. And again, to make a long story short, it eventually colonizes the world. The advanced capitalist countries, the first ones, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, they take over the whole world. They carve up Africa. They take over much of Asia. The United States says, you can't come here. We're going to take over Latin America. It's going to be our manifest destiny to make that a special place. The early successful American capitalists wanted to carve out Latin America for us, for the Americans. And so it was. Capitalism grew spectacularly in North America, Europe, and Japan. And the rest of the world was pretty much ravaged. The raw materials taken out of Latin America, the metals. We learned to enjoy goods that came from there. Coffee, tea, rubber, fill in the blank. The world was our oyster, we in the capitalist center. We even developed languages like that. Periphery, center. Wow. Capitalism growing in the center. Ravaging an entire planet. Condemning Africa to a poverty it still has and suffers from. And the masses in China likewise. And the masses in India likewise, still. But the workers in the center struggled through unions, through political parties, to get a piece of all of this successful capitalist development in the center. And so their wages rose. And now we come to the third and final chapter of capitalism. The one that's been in place since the 60s and 70s. And here's the lesson for us. Capitalism has developed the technology, the internet, telecommunications, jet travel, so that it can get around the world and touch the world and control the world and see the world literally on a global scale. And the capitalists have noticed something. They're paying much higher wages in North America, Europe, and Japan than they could get away with paying in the parts of the world that they were ravaging in the previous 150 years of colonialism. So they got an idea. We could make more profit if we moved the center of capitalism away from Europe, Japan, and North America and over to China, India, Brazil, and so on. That's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. With or without this crisis, and however soon we get out of it, if we do, the sad news is we're on a long-term development of capitalism as the capitalists, for the same reason they always did everything: growth, market control, profits. Before they brought everything in the world to North America, Europe, and Japan. Now they're taking it away. And I don't think most of the people of Europe, North America, and Japan have yet come to terms with what it means to have a capitalist system that used to work in such a way that the wealth of the world was collected and brought here, but is now busy moving a huge portion of the productive wealth of the world somewhere else, and saying to the mass of the people in North America, Europe, and Japan, we really don't need you, and so we're really not going to pay you, neither directly in the form of a decent job with decent pay. For many of you, there'll be no jobs at all. And we're not going to fund the government to give you social services because we're not focused on you. Our growth is somewhere else. We used to provide no social services in the third world. Now we're providing them there because that's where we're producing. We'll bring back the profits, and those will make wealthy people out of the top 10% in Europe, North America, and Japan. But for the average person, no. The same system that developed through the first and second stages of capitalism is the system we have now. But the very logic of capitalism, the same logic all the way through, is now bringing bad results for North America, Europe, and Japan. The jobs are going to India, China, Brazil, and so on. And Americans have to understand, if they permit capitalism to continue in the same logic and in the same way that it always has, they will not be the beneficiaries as they were, because capitalism's way of functioning has set its sights on growth, development, and prosperity somewhere else. It's a serious question, long overdue for the debate that our society is afraid to begin on what that means. In the final time remaining to me, I'm going to turn to the questions that I respond to. I'm going to give a little more time this week because I always feel a little guilty that so many questions come in, which we welcome. And let me say again, please let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what you'd like us to focus on. But I feel guilty that I can't answer all of them. I try to answer some in email, and I try to pick those that it would be the greatest interest to answer here. So let's do a few together. First question basically says, I have heard about and been interested in employee stock ownership plans. They're often called ESOPs, E-S-O-P, and they basically refer to an arrangement in which the workers in an enterprise become its owners. The shares of the company stop being in the hands of outside investors and move instead into the hands of the workers in that enterprise themselves. Does that exist? Yes. It has existed on and off throughout the history of the United States, and it exists now. There are ESOPs. There are laws and rules and associations devoted to that kind of arrangement. It's perfectly legal and indeed widespread. It is different from the term worker co-op. Now, the term co-op simply covers many things. We've talked about that before. Cooperatives can be people getting together, for example, to share a piece of land. They each do a little thing on the land, perhaps raise vegetables, things like that. But they have a kind of a co-op. They may cooperatively own the land. They may or may not cooperatively farm the land, but that would be a land co-op. Then there are things like food co-ops, where people get together and sustain a store that buys food in bulk, cheaply, and resells it to the members of the co-op. They don't own the store, although they may. They mainly agree to be a cooperative purchasing club, you might say, a purchasing co-op that buys food and then distributes it amongst themselves. A worker co-op is something different, because there what's cooperative is the work process. The workers run, control, direct their own work activity. All these things can go by the name of co-op, but they are really very different. Let me give you an example. Workers can become the owners of the enterprise in which they work, but not the directors. What does that mean? And by the way, this is very common. The workers are the shareholders. They select a board of directors. Much like in capitalism, the owners of the shares, who can be somebody else, not workers, they select the board of directors. But if the workers become the owners, they select the board of directors. The board of directors makes the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. The workers then are owners, but they are said in the lingo of finance to be passive. They don't directly run the enterprise. They just own it. Just like many shareholders are very passive. They collect their quarterly dividend. That's all they care about. They don't know or care about what goes on in the enterprise. Workers can be passive owners of their own enterprise. A workers' co-op is not that. A workers' co-op says, no, what the workers are most interested in is controlling, directing their own work activity. They may not care who owns it. They may be perfectly happy to have shareholders outside to whom they give a dividend or not. That's up to them. But they direct the enterprise. So you can have workers owning who don't direct, and you can have workers directing who don't own. All of those combinations are possible. By the way, there's nothing unique about co-ops having these options. Capitalism has them too. A capitalist can be an individual man or woman who directs what goes on in the business, owns the business at the same time. Or you can have a stock company in which the owners are over there and the directors are over here. Completely different people, not the same people. So you can have a board of directors who also own the stock. You can have a board of directors who own no stock, and you can have stockholders who have nothing to do with directing. So you have the range of possibilities in both systems. What we're interested in here, what I focus on in my work, is worker co-ops. For me, the crucial thing is not that workers own. Whatever value that is, if I were involved in an effort for workers to own, I would be using their position as owners to acquire, if they don't have it, the position of directing themselves. For me, the crucial issue is workers making the decisions, workers becoming their own board of directors. That's why I coined that phrase, Worker Self-Directed Enterprise, WSDE, because for me, the crucial thing is the decisions. What is getting produced, what technology is used, where the production occurs, and what is done with the profits. Those decisions in a capitalist firm are made by the board of directors. And that's what I want workers to be in a position to do, because that's what it means to bring democracy to the workplace. That's what it means to have a commitment to democracy. And that's what it means to want to live in a society where the decisions in the economy that are supposed to benefit the people will actually do it because it's the people making those decisions. We now have a pretense. We pretend the economy serves the people, even though a tiny minority of us, 0.0001%, are the boards of directors of the 500 or 1,000 corporations that dominate our economy. And I think they make the decision to move production out of the country. They make the decision to use technologies that are not healthy for us. They make the decision to use profits to pay sky-high CEO salaries, everything we've talked about today. If you don't want those outcomes, then you can't have a tiny, rich minority being in the decision-making role. If you want the economy to work for the people as a whole, give the people as a whole democratic control of the enterprises that produce the goods and services upon which we all depend. Next, and the last question we will have time for today. unless I can do it even faster than I usually do. Here's a question about non-profit corporations. Could I explain how non-profit corporations work, the kinds that run our universities, our charities, our hospitals, and so on? To explain this, I need to introduce another concept, tax-exempt. The important concept is tax-exempt. Under the laws of the United States, both the federal law and the laws in each of the 50 states, certain kinds of enterprises, certain kinds of corporations are not required to pay taxes. They are tax-exempt corporations. And their tax exemption is given to them because of the specific kind of work they do. Charitable work is eligible. Educational work is usually eligible. Hospital or medical care type of work is usually eligible. So they're not required to pay taxes. That's the crucial issue. And the idea was these are service institutions. They might not exist if we tax them. We all benefit from them, so let's give ourselves a break by saying to them, we want you so badly, we won't tax you. Let me give you the best example I know, Yale University in New Haven. Begun in the colonial time of the United States, before we were an independent country. Set up by some Protestant ministers, started Yale. And they went to the community and they said, look, we need to train ministers so that the good folk here in Connecticut, where Yale is located, will have preachers in their little churches. We have to train them. So we're going to set up a school to train ministers. Everybody in the immediate area of New Haven and Connecticut will benefit by having a minister in the pulpit of the local Protestant church. So please, we can't set up a school if we had to pay taxes. We just don't have the money. So give us a break, give us a tax exemption, and that way we'll be able to function and produce something that all of you who give us the tax break benefit from. Because everybody understood if the school is created for the ministers and they don't pay any taxes, they still will call a police person when they need it. They'll call a fire person when they need it. They will need the roads to be kept clear when they need it. In other words, they'll need services from the local community, but by not paying taxes, they don't help sustain them. So the services they get will have to be paid for by all the rest of us who do pay taxes. So giving a tax exemption is a burden for everybody else whose taxes have to go up to offset the effect of a person who uses public services but pays no taxes. Long ago, Yale University, which got the tax exemption, stopped being a place primarily to train ministers. Yale is now a school for very wealthy people. It's extremely expensive. It takes mostly upper-income people from around the world. I myself am a graduate of Yale University, so I know exactly what I'm talking about. And they are now a multi-billion, with a B, corporation. They're not the poor collection of ministers that they once were, but they have fought hard, very hard, to hold on to their tax exemption. They don't want to give it up, even though they do not primarily service Connecticut. They do not primarily provide ministers. It's a large stretch for them to claim any of the conditions that got them the tax exemption. Along the way, it became popular to say about tax-exempt corporations, not that they were tax-exempt, because that highlights what they get away with that the rest of us can't. So instead, the word became non-profit. But it is not correct. They don't necessarily make a profit, but it's not relevant. They don't pay taxes because of what they do, not because of whether they do or do not make profit. I will use Yale again. Most of the years over the last 40 that I have watched Yale's books, Yale made a profit. That is, they took in more revenue than they had expenses, usually in the tens of millions of dollars per year. But here's what they did. They took that money, the excess, the profit, and they put it into their endowment, their savings fund, you might call it. And they called that, which is legal, an expense. We have to provide for our future, they said. The government said, okay. The government didn't care much because it can't tax them anyway, because Yale, as an educational institution, is tax-exempt. So please be aware, if you're tax-exempt, it's because you've got a law that got passed somewhere along the way that gives it to you. And you were clever enough, and you got enough friends in high places to keep your tax exemption, whether or not you actually made profits and whether or not you were still doing primarily what you got the tax exemption for. And that is true for many. Bottom line, whether it's a charity or a hospital, it often can make profits, and even if it doesn't, it's because it uses the real profits to give its top officials the high salaries that have recently been exposed, or to put the money away for a fund for God knows what in the future. If you're interested in tax-exempts, be aware, it's been a boondoggle for many institutions for a long time and is long overdue for some big questions, like so much in our economy. This is Richard Wolff. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining me for Economic Update, and I look forward to being with you again next week.